I'm going to tell a story from Fionn and the Salmon of Knowledge, but I've got to give people a bit of the sort of structure around the cosmology to help people to be able to understand what's going on in the story. So it's giving you some explanation. So I want to start, and some of my stuff will be weaving in history as well as sort of animist practices. So Christianisation of the Gaelic pagan animist world began around 420 AD. The largely agrarian society had a complex kinship system that oversaw family and clan ties, their relationships to land, the laws of inheritance, etc. This system of kin was also informed by an animist cosmology that informed the rituals and initiations, stories, how to work with ancestors and spirits of place to maintain balance and the fecundity of the earth. So in the Christianising process, the dominant threat to their rule came from a group of people called the Druids. Among other roles, they were the spiritual political leaders of the Gaels. So both when the Romans invaded Celtic Europe around 50 BC, when Julius Caesar was running amok and murdered off about 2 million people, the Druids were really focused on. And then in other times of history too, the Druids were the main ones that were taken out. They had to take them out. So around about the 6th century AD, in that part of Scotland and Ireland that was on the edge of the Roman Empire that wasn't colonised by the Romans, the Druids had largely lost their power. But one part of the pagan Gaelic social structure that was not perceived as a threat by the Christians, this was the role of the Fili. And this is who I'm talking about. So in the poem I just read, that blackbird is the Fili, is the poet. So what he's talking about is St. Kevin is keeping the poetry tradition, the storytelling tradition alive. That's what he's referring to. It is a blackbird, but the blackbird is the storyteller. And that's what we're talking about today. So in the singular, it's Fila. In the plural, it's Fili. So Unfila is literally one who sees. And now that's commonly understood as a poet seer. Their role was to advise the clan heads or kings on matters both worldly and otherworldly, to divinate through reading the clouds, through movements and songs of ravens, to seek inspiration for poems, songs and stories, usually on the edge of water, and to be a repository of genealogical and tribal memory, using the landscape as a memory tool, and to teach the next generation of Fili. The Fili, in the Gaelic context, are quintessentially the land, listening and speaking. So there were 7 families who traditionally held the role of Fili, and they survived, more or less, until the mid-17th century. And this was largely because of a meeting that happened in 575 with a monk called Columba or Colm, who was both a monk and a Fila. And he met with the heads of the O'Neill clan and the king of Dalriata. Dalriata being a kingdom partly of western Scotland and the north of Ireland. So there's this massive kingdom that was from around the 6th century AD to about the 10th. That was a kingdom of its own. So the king of that. And what they agreed was the Fili or the Fila would come into the monastic orders. So, if you will, the pagan tradition was able to hidey, sneaky, by being in the monastic tradition, and so it was able to survive for another 1,000 years. So this is part of what we're actually, because if you're going to try and engage with this politics and history, you need to know these little things to be able to understand where it comes from. So this is called syncretism. And this is why when we talk about the Gaelic world, we need to, and the Gaelic animist world, we need to include 1,000 years of the Gaelic Church, or what's now called Celtic Christianity. So it's not either or thinking, it's both and. It's complicated. So that's where I was quoting a saint, but because the saints were holding a lot of this stuff, and the saints are often goddesses, and they're actually got allusions to other stuff around the land and the traditional Gaelic forms. So they're holding this animist knowledge, but you've got to be able to read through the layers. And that's partly what I'm trying to explain or share today. So it's important to understand that the Catholic Church never really got total control of the Irish people, and I'm not talking here about the Western Scotland, until really the Great Hunger in Angkor Moor in 1846, 1852, when 1 million people were taken out, killed, and then 2 million emigrated. So the society was cut in half. And then the Catholic Church was able to take over. So really there's always been this battle internal between, if you will, the pagan and the Christian within Christendom. And the Christian Church did not win that until very recently. So if you go to Ireland, if you come from Ireland, This stuff is just normal. It's not like a big deal and, oh, wow, let's all do this. It's like half the society knows this anyway, and they sing about it and they hang around and they're taught all this in primary school. So it's not a big deal. But for us who are in the diaspora, it is a big deal. So now a bit of shameless self-promotion. I'm actually doing a talk this week, and there's stuff over there, on how the Gaels lost their indigeneity at the Hillsville Library. So you might be interested, or you might be over it after I've done this rant. So, but anyway, in terms of actually giving that history of how these breaks that happen through history. So it's like a 5,000 year reading of the animist tradition or the pagan tradition. So what I want to do now is I want to share that in mythology there are two traditions. I'm going to call them the insider and the outsider tradition. Now the insider tradition, what we're talking about here is what's called the Ulster cycle, and this is especially to do with the exploits of Culin and Queen Maeve and the battles over a brown and white cow. So it's not just the Hindus into cows, we're into cows too. And these are very much Celtic stories rooted in the Proto-Indo-European culture that moved west from the steppes of Russia around 5000 BC, across Western Europe, and arrived in Ireland and the British Isles around 500 BC.
So they're actually colonists.
What's that?
They're actually colonists. They came from the same source.
Yes. So this is the myths of a settled and agrarian people. Now, what I'm going to talk about is what's called the outsider stories. And this is the stories of the Fenian cycle related to Finn McCool, the Fianna, Fionn's son Oisin, and the birth of poetry. So these folks lived on the edge of society in the bogs and forests. They married deer, having children with them, and their cousins were wolfhounds. So that you see a whole different layering of what's going on because you're actually engaging with a different level or different dimensions of society. This is the hunter-gatherer still. So it's got layers, and one of the layers of the outsiders is the hunter-gatherer sort of dimension is still present. Okay, so these stories, the Finn McCool ones, have Christian, Celtic, and more importantly, pre-Celtic layers. Now, when people talk about Gaelic traditions, what they're normally doing is they're talking about the Celts, and the Celts come across around 500 BC. Most of the amazing shit made, the Neolithic tombs, the portal tombs, the stone circles, were made by people pre-Celtic. They weren't Celtic, and you need to understand that. So it's how do we engage with that crew? Because there's no written records. What they have is what they left in terms of the stones. Now those places and things they built have these Celtic and Christian sort of layers to it, but they go right back. And really to about 10,000 BC, but it's about how you actually understand this layering. So we use the word Celtic and Gaelic, and truthfully it's wrong. But we don't have a better language, but we need to be able to unpack it. And that's what I'm suggesting the Finn McCool story does, is it opens some of that stuff up for us. And I'm going to try and do that for you today when I tell the story.
So like it's like kind of the period talks about using like Gaelic or Celtic is like the same at the same time period, but it isn't talking about before then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's this whole history of 8,000 years of people living there, but we don't know and we don't talk about it, and it's just sort of often kept out of history. But that's what when you read myth well, I'm going to suggest, you can actually start seeing where they're still there, and you're going, aha. And this is where I think the deeper stuff happens, is that, and again, it's not exact, but this is what we're sort of playing with. So I'm going to share a little bit around the cosmology, because I need to explain to you where the Salmon of Knowledge comes from. So there's this place called the other world, which is part of this world, but not one you can necessarily obviously see. And in this place is a place called Tobar Sagas, or the Well of Sagas. And the Sagas has 9 hazelnuts. If you want to just pass that around, there's some hazelnuts. And feel the hazelnuts, touch the hazelnuts, etc. Now, these hazelnuts drop into the river, or into the pond, and then the salmon comes and eats them. So the hazelnuts contain something called imbus, which is wisdom. Okay, now, this Well of Sagas is also looked after by 2 gods. One is called Boan, which basically in Gaelic or Irish or Gaelic means white cow. White cow is also the name for the Milky Way. It's also the name for the Boyne River, which we're going to come back to. It's a place itself. And also another male water deity called Nectar. And so sometimes the Salmon of Knowledge moves from the other world to this world. It lives there in the other world, but but sometimes it comes across and it interacts with humans, because that's where things like the Samhain, when the veil between this world and the other way is thin, where you can actually interact with the ancestors or the dead, and you can actually move across, or there's a lot more interaction that happens. So just got to give you a bit of that framing, so when I tell the story of Fionn and the Cool, it's like, I sort of have an understanding of what you're doing. So what I'm going to suggest is, what's stunning about this insight or this commentary around the relationship between water, hazelnuts and salmon is that without these humans can't live. So basically they're sacred. And what I mean by that is they're the source of all human life. So that's what humans eat. So the very question of the relationship between the prey and the hunter is basic. And that's what's the most sacred relationship of all. Because it's the water relating to the hazelnut relates to the salmon, and the human act of eating the salmon that actually creates wisdom. So it's a very basic, localised, very in place organisation around food production that actually is the most basic and sacred thing of the whole cosmos. And everyone does it all the time, but we just sort of miss it. No, don't worry about it, just eat, just throw it down your neck. And it's like, no, this is the most basic thing there is. So this relationship between water, hazelnut and salmon is the source of all life, death, rebirth mystery. And it's the deepest level, it's who we are. So what it's doing is, this ancestral wisdom I'm going to suggest here is, this question of sacredness is around the act of killing and the act of sacrifice. And a lot of people and most communities have forgotten this. This is the root of the animist revival. Without this, animism means nothing. Because this is the heart. This is, of all the different rituals that we come to, you're going there. That's where you go to and where you come from. Because this is the basic interaction that creates life. And it's your relationship with that kin that gives you the possibility for life. Which is why I'm saying, look at your hand. Because you wouldn't have that hand if you didn't have that relationship with water and hazelnut and salmon. You can change the nature of the animals or the creatures, but it's still basic, no matter who we are. So this other creature sacrifices themselves so it can eat. And this is a sacred bond. This is the most sacred bond we have. Because without that, we're actually nothing. We don't exist, we can't flourish, and we can't be. So thus the foundation of the culture is that sacred relationship between hunter and prey. And this can't be taken for granted or sullied, or else life itself will be compromised. So this primary observation necessitates numerous inherited responsibilities by different parts of the clan or tribe, so as to keep balance or good relations between all the different elements of the sacred act. So I'm going to suggest that the Druids and the Fenian and all those people, their job, that was their main job. Keeping that sacred relationship alive, making the story so that everyone understood that, and we're living in the rhythms of that relationship of either sacrifice or killing, depending on how you want to tell the story, it's the same thing. Okay, so what I want to quickly do is take off my animist hat and put on my Marxist cap to historicise the debate around the questions of sacredness, around the eating of the flesh of another being, and the centrality of sacrifice to human being and community. So this killing sacrifice motive is obviously reworked in the Christian Eucharist. Those of us, especially Catholic backgrounds, we know this very deeply. And it's witnessed in the ritual, in the reenactment of the Last Supper, the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ, who sacrificed himself so that all humans can be liberated from sin, and we partake in his body or the community of Christ by eating the consecrated blood and wine. So you can see that the Christians are very smart. They know they're working that theory, and they work on the same thing because it's a very primary relationship, and they've just reimagined it in terms of their own community. And as it turns out, to rework empire, but that's another question. So I'm going to suggest in the Reformation of the early 16th century, one of the hottest debates that caused the split within the church was that over transubstantiation, which is essentially whether or not that bread and wine actually becomes the body of Christ or not, and whether it's just symbolic. So with the Catholics arguing it does, and the Protestants arguing the latter. But I want to suggest that the Protestant perspective of the Eucharist ritual is purely symbolic, and in no sense real, is thus another sense of ripping, and this actually allows what Marx called the unleashing of violence, called primitive accumulation, to allow the emergence of capitalism. Because once again, we get further and further away from this basic ritual, this basic sacredness that's it's central to our core. And once again, when that ripping allows, and you allow that, the looting of the Americas, the trading in black bodies, the burning of the witches. If you look at when all these things were going gangbusters, it's because of that rise of the Protestant ethic. I'm not saying therefore you have to. The Catholics lined up with empire in the 3rd century with Constantine, but that allowed the emergence of capitalism. And again, at a symbolic level, it's that ripping away from this basic sacrifice killing question. Ripping it over it. Okay, so when you get further away from holding that killing sacrifice question, then your culture can become more destructive and death-loving. And I think that's the essence of where we're at in terms of, that's a symbolic way of going, this is how we got into this giant mess, and this is part of the dynamic. Okay, so I'll take that Marxist cap off, and I'm sure lots of you are going, what the fuck? But, and I'll put back my animist cap. So the ritual to become a Fili or poetsia is called imbas foronsai. So in the ritual, the initiate eats raw flesh, gets wrapped in the skin of a white cow, and then goes into trance to receive a vision. So they're reliving that basic creation story, that basic sacrifice, and that's the basis of how you actually become the storyteller, because you're very much related to this basic primary sacred relationship around killing or sacrifice, of which all of life comes out of. Okay, so before we go on to the story, there's one other thing I need to add. This is all about place. Every mythology, even though you've no doubt heard lots of mythology, especially Greek, and it's actually been displaced. When you bring these stories to a place and you put them in the place and you tell those stories, that's when it starts the rubber starts to hit the road. That's the real thing. So the place we're talking about here is the Boyne Valley, especially, because in Ireland you probably have heard of four provinces, Ulster, Munster, Leinster and Connacht, but there's a 5th one called the Meader, or the Middle, and that's sort of otherworldly, and that's what we'd call parts of Meath and West Meath. And this is also the spiritual centre of Ireland in terms of where the main sacred sites of those people pre-Celtic built their stuff was there. So this includes places like Bruna Bonia, which is temple to the goddess Boann. This is the hill of Uisneach, the hill of Tara. This is a raven feather gifted to me at the hill of Tara after doing some rituals, if you want to pass that around. Now these are centres of druidic power, these are centres of political power, these are centres of the reproduction of that Indigenous society. So in that place, so when we hear the Fionn McCool story and you realise that you're in this place, yes, there's an actual literal place, but it also deeply connects to the other world. It's the centre of the other world as well. So it's a place where you get this engagement with other things. The dead, the ancestors are very present and very powerful there. And all around you are these sacred sites. And you're actually, there's the river of where Fionn actually, we're going to talk about in a sec. It's like, this mythology is based in a place. And this place also not only is the literal place, but it also has this other place where the well of Sagas flows from. And this is where all life and all water comes from. It's where the Salmon of Knowledge comes from. So these are the bits that you need to put together, I'm going to suggest, to start rebuilding an animist cosmology, having the place part of the relationship to the stories, of the mythic stories. Okay, so, and the last one being, of course, the River Boyne, who's named after Boann, the guardian spirit who looks after the sacred river. So the river itself, as well as Bruna Bonia, which means temple for Bonia, so and this predates the Celts, that is also very close to here as well. And there's a whole sort of sacred area there. And if you've ever been there, it's an amazing place. Now, one of the other things that comes up is if you go to that place, the River Bonia, the River Boyne, just in front of where Bruna Bonia actually is, there's a place, because it's a tidal river, so it actually has salt water coming up and fresh water, if you will, is coming down, so they actually meet. Now in that place, when the salmon come to spawn, just in front, or it was anyway, quite close, is the salmon will be coming to spawn, they'll swim up, and they're going in salt water, and they can't just go from salt water to fresh water. They have to stop and be very still for a while, and then move into the fresh water. And that's the place they picked for this temple to be built. Because they were actually moving between worlds, if you will. The salmon, they were watching them. And going, because I don't know if you've eaten fresh salmon, but I'd be watching them too. And this relationship, it's very good. And you're going, oh, look at these guys do. This is interesting. And they spend this time, and then they sit there for a few minutes, and then they can flow into the fresh water. So it's a liminal space already between fresh and salt water. So these people who, lived with the salmon, knew their ways, they were watching it. Where do we put this temple, or this place? Let's put it right here. This is the spot. This is the good spot here. Okay, so now I feel we've got enough infrastructure to do the story of Fionn and the Salmon of Knowledge. So the mythic story related to place and giving you some of the sort of architecture or the sort of framework to hold it. So now I just want to do the story itself. Okay, let's have a drink of water. So Colm McNaughton was a leader of the Fionn, and they were a highly esteemed band of warriors whose job it was to protect Ireland from invaders. He answered directly, so excuse me if my pronunciation is not good, because this is very difficult, as Marita's shirking over there and smiling, going, oh God. Con Cehach, High King of Ireland, who carried the title of the High King of Tara, which is this place. This is where the kings would be and the sacrifices, etc. would happen. Now, Colm was a proud warrior, and he became very interested in a beautiful young woman called Myrna, and her name was Myrna of the Fair Neck. But her druid father, Tay, was not so keen on the idea. So Colm abducted Myrna from all the reports. Myrna was very keen on the idea, and they ran off together, and pretty soon Myrna was pregnant. So Myrna's father was totally enraged, and he went to the High King to get redress. And the king agreed that Colm had done the wrong thing, and he ordered the one-eyed Colm McNaughton to send his dudes and to go and get them and kill them both. So for 6 months, Colm and Myrna evaded Colm and his network of spies, but eventually the two warriors and their respective men met at the Battle of Nuka. The battle was ferocious, the ravens were very happy. But in the end, Colm was killed and then decapitated by the one-eyed Colm. So victorious, Colm then set off in search of Myrna, who by now was very heavily pregnant. So in hiding, Myrna gave birth to a son, whom she named Demne. Now Demne, its meaning is young male deer. Demne was given to Myrna's druidess sisters, Bull and her female companion Leith, who lived in the Slieve Blava Mountains in counties Laos and Alfali. And Myrna took off to continue hiding from Colm and his men. So Demne grew up under the guidance of these two highly skilled and knowledgeable women. His aunts made him do chores, which made him strong. They also made him run up and down the mountain and trained him in the use of various weapons, so he was able to both hunt and protect himself. His druidic aunts also trained him in the arts of healing, but most importantly, they taught him how to be in the forest, how to listen, how to communicate with the different creatures and beings, and how to be in the forest. When Demne was 15, his aunts got word that Colm and his men were closing in. Preparing to leave, Colm and his men suddenly burst into the compound, searching frantically for Demne. With great presence of mind and evasive skill, he was able to outwit his pursuers and hid down a foxhole. After Colm and his men left, they knew he couldn't stay with his aunts any longer, and he hit the road. He travelled far and had many adventures until one day he came across Arain Boyne, the River Boyne. And wandering along its banks, he came across an old feelie or poet-seer whose name was Finnegas. They got to talking, and Demne asked Finnegas many questions. Who was he? Where was he from? What was he doing in this place in the river? And Finnegas explained that he was a poet, and he had a powerful vision, and that vision was that the Salmon of Knowledge would be released from the Well of Sagas in the other world and placed into the River Boyne, and that a person in this world with the name of Fionn would catch the salmon and eat it, and he would be gifted all the knowledge that the world has to offer. Demne was impressed with Finnegan's answers and what he was doing, and asked to become his student. Every day for 7 years, Finnegas had dropped a line in the Bonya River, hoping to catch the Salmon of Knowledge. And every day he'd been unsuccessful. So Finnegas got to teaching poetry to Demne, and Demne got to doing chores around the place, like collecting wood for the fire, gathering herbs, catching small game like birds and rabbits, to make life more bearable for them both. One day, while Demne was practicing memory jigs, he heard Finnegas scream and looked over, and the older man had grabbed the rod and with all his might was trying to land the salmon. It was a heroic battle, but after 3 days, finally, totally exhausted, Finnegas landed the Salmon of Knowledge onto the bank. And when there was no more fight left in either of them. Finnegas gave very strict orders to Demne on how to cook the salmon, and most importantly, not to eat any of it. This done, Finnegas went off to bed and rest, and to prepare for the big feast that was coming. And Demne got everything ready to cook the salmon slowly and perfectly. As Finnegas slept, Demne got to work, collecting wood and fashioning the grill so that the salmon could be cooked perfectly. And as he cooked the salmon, he turned it over and spotted a big bubble had appeared on its side. And wanting everything to be perfect, he poked it with his finger. The bubble burst and hot salmon oil splashed all over his thumb. And without thinking, he popped the burning thumb into his mouth. The sense of time passed away. An incredible sense of elation welled up in his chest until it felt like his chest was going to explode with joy. Light around him began to fuse, and then he began to fuse with the light, and then there was just oneness. Total, complete oneness. No separation, no thinking, no time. And all that was a timeless unitary state of being, fused with an absolute deep understanding of everything. Words could not capture or express the learnings revealed. Finnegas had rested deeply, and he got up refreshed and ready for his feast. And when he saw Demne's eyes, wise way beyond his years, he knew what had happened. And he asked, "Have you eaten from the Salmon of Knowledge after I told you explicitly not to?" No, I didn't eat the salmon," Demne implored. "I did exactly as you asked, and when I saw a bubble raise on the flesh of the salmon, and I pushed it so it didn't look ugly, and the bubble burst, and my thumb got covered in hot oil, and I put it in my mouth to cool it down." Finnegas understood what had happened, and he understood that the Salmon of Knowledge was not for him. And he explained to Demne, "Your real name is Fionn, and you have eaten the Salmon of Knowledge. Now you are a Fila, who has access to all the knowledge of the world. Now you must eat the rest of the salmon, and then you must leave, as I have nothing more to teach you." Fionn sat down and silently and joyously ate the salmon, and reflected on being a poet. And the following day he packed up his stuff and moved on to his next adventure. Okay, so that's just a little bit of the mythic story. You can read many of its children's books, it's whatever, it's all these different levels and layers to it. But now what I want to do is I want to talk about the relationship between myth, land, ritual and initiation. Because it's a way of how you engage that story is, yes, there's the mythic story in place, but when you create ritual around that story in place and something else starts to happen, and then the role initiation plays as well in terms of that. So what I just did was I told you a bit, it was just an example of mythic storytelling. So storytelling is another way of being in the world. This mythic storytelling is another way of being in the world. And it's not based on a categorical or post-enlightenment or Western form of rationality. This mythic way is much more intuitive, it's much more deeply grounded in silence and stillness, and it demands that the mind, body and spirit are not split or dissociated. So I'm just going to suggest that because of the dominance of the categorical form of rationality in the culture we live in, we tend to what's quite often simplistic either or dualistic thinking. Man, woman, black, white, good, bad. But there are other forms of rationale, and myth is one of them, which, to be effective, needs to be deeply grounded in place as part of an animate living cosmos. But to approach this way of knowing and being means that we need to be able to engage in both and thinking. And this way of thinking means we need to become much more comfortable living in paradox and not knowing. Herein lies, numerous old ones have suggested, the portal to wisdom, the not knowing, which for most people is an anathema. So I want to suggest that the story of Fionn and the Salmon of Knowledge is actually the voice of the land speaking. Not this land, but of the land that many of us have come from, or our ancestors have come from. So this mythic story is an attempt to open up a soul-level dialogue with the listeners. So I want to make an observation, and it's central to an animist cosmology, and that is that the land remembers. And this has two meanings. The first is that the land actually holds and transmits memories and stories. And the second is that when humans are fragmented or not whole or dismembered, the land can actually bring them back together to make a whole once again. That's what the land remembers means. It's got that. And that help us in that process are these mythic stories. So the land remembers. So as you will have noticed from the Fionn and the Salmon of Knowledge story, certain places are mentioned. And these are real places. Places you can visit, spend time in, sit and listen and watch. And when you visit these places, you can pay attention to what creatures or birds or elements start to interact or speak with you. The land is always in dialogue with its creatures, elements and landforms. And you can also walk these lands, retelling the myths in the very places that they happen. You can do it. I've done it. I know Marita's done it in various, and I'm sure other people have done it. So one of the central places mentioned in this story is the Boyne River, that flows from County Kildare through to Meath, where it meets the sea. And this part of the world, as I mentioned earlier, maybe not down as far as Kildare, but certainly Meath and Westmeath is part of being the Meader, or the middle of the island of Ireland, which is a both this and otherworldly place. And as I explained earlier, this is a place also that's like the epicentre of sacred sites. And this is part of the reason why, because myths actually are being held there, and you get the layers of them. So one way to open these stories up, much like cracking open a hazelnut, and the numerous layers of knowledge and wisdom that are contained in them, are to do ritual in these places. Which again, some people in the room have done that. And it's my observation that when you create a ritual space, don't worry about doing it perfectly, worry about your intention. And they'll help you out. But what needs to happen will happen. And the key to powerful and transformative ritual is for you and your ego and your pettiness and attachments to get out of the way. The more that happens, the better the ritual space is. So humility and gratitude are the foundations of ritual. And this said, inside the ritual space, you need to be attentive. In other words, you're doing a ritual is you're opening yourself up to the ancestors and ancestral wisdom. And they can take many forms to speak with and through you. So as you develop your relationship to place through ritual and ongoing listening and connect more with the stories and creatures and landforms that exist there, you might be advised by the land, something comes up and says it's time for you to do an initiation. And then these initiations are necessary to open yourself up to different layers of comprehension, healing and action necessary in that place. Perhaps the initiation is necessary for you to take on certain roles, or it's for certain knowledge to be transmitted, or you need to do certain forms of ancestral healings. I don't know, but that's what the ritual is in place. That's where you find these things out. So my contention that myth plus place plus ritual plus initiation are the foundations of an animist cosmology. Layer it over the top of this eightfold festivals associated with the shifts in the seasons, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, Lunasa, the movements of the sun and moon, the equinoxes and solstices, and I'm just going to suggest that lightheartedly you have there what's called an animist starter kit. So you actually have, there's everything there, you don't need any more. It's all ready to roll. Starter kit. So it's like rock and roll, here we go. So now what I want to do is I want to address two bunyips in the room. And there's a reason why I've called them bunyips, which I'm sure you're going to guess. And so all of what I've said up to this point applies to essentially for somebody from the Gaelic world who still lives there or somewhere nearby. Now, nearly everyone in this room doesn't live in their ancestral place of knowledge or origin. So instead, we live in a colonised place where the humans and non-humans indigenous to this place have been treated brutally and with little regard. And I don't need to explain all this to you. The humans have been dispossessed, much of their language and culture smashed, children literally ripped out of the arms of their mothers and fathers, and then made in the image of the coloniser. The non-humans have been treated much worse in many cases. So this painful and ongoing bunyip reality has two central implications for those of us engaging in the animist. So this bunyip reality is where we're living, I'm suggesting. The first is that despite all the contradictions in history, we actually live here. Many of us were born here. So we have a relationship to this place. And so being part of this land, we have obligations to the creatures, waterways, stories, and other peoples of this land. And we're not fulfilling our obligations. That's the problem. We're not doing what we should be doing. We have ancestors from other places, Ireland, Scotland, Poland, Italy, Thailand. But to be able to be part of this land, we need to address the severing from the ancestors most of us have experienced as part of the long and painful process of us ending up here. In other words, we can't be part of the healing of this land and its many peoples if we don't heal our own ancestral wounds. Because you don't know the obligations, and you're too cut off and dissociated to be able to even start the process of engaging with the obligations of what it means to be from here. So of course this is difficult, often messy, and there are not many guides in this process. But if we don't know our ancestors and their stories and the places they live with and the processes ending us up here, then we have very little to offer except the abstract ideas about the world sitting in our heads. And I don't think that's very much to offer. We can go a lot deeper than that. The reality is, of course, that many of the folks who did and continue to do the killing, the raping, taking of children, the destruction of ecosystems, etc., come from cultures and places that experience the very same or similar forms of colonial violence as here. And that's part of our rupturing. Because, yeah, we might have white skin, but a shitload of us also come from places where there was mass dispossessions, language destruction, and layers of genocides, etc. And we've forgotten all that, run from that, and then we're here, and we don't know what we're doing. So like our Israeli brothers and sisters in the IDF, and I bring that up for good reason at the moment in Gaza, it's a lot easier for us to project violence onto others than face our own demons and legacies of trauma. So this is a challenge of addressing the workings of intergenerational trauma, I think is addressed at every one of us. Because we can't really learn the obligations of our relationship to this place if we don't at least aren't involved in the process of healing our ancestral lines so we can actually hear what's going on, because we know where we come from and so we can know who we are in this place. So the situation we face is this. In the context of widespread ecological and social collapse, and you can book me for children's parties if you want, we are being compelled to heal our own severing from the ancestors in order to become part of this land and heal a place that's also experienced massive colonial violence. So I didn't say it was easy, but this is just the context we're in. So the legacies of this violence are palpable. Everywhere we look, inside our own hearts and heads and the world around us. We can see it, we feel it, we are it. We need to create the individuals and communities, which is why we're doing this series of talks, that can hold and tend these wounds and just sit in the earth while not knowing what to do and not having an answer. And maybe the silence, we can start to listen in a whole new way and tend and be humble and seek direction from the land and her often many unseen forces. So the second bunyip in the room is that even though it seems that what I'm doing is promoting a form of reconstructed Gaelic paganism or animism, and to a degree it's true, but as we make deeper connections to this place and we come in contact with various forms and layers of ancestral wisdoms, we will find that our agency tends to drop away, and the land with its spirits of place, ancestors, totems and songlines begins to take over. We may stay out working with the land, but as the relationship deepens, the land begins to work us, and we are left utterly hollowed out and transformed. In this process, we may become hybrid beings, partly where we come from and partly present here. Or maybe we become fully immersed in the lore of this place. To be honest, I do not know. And I think it will be different in different places. I don't think there's an absolute anything going on here. And I suspect, it'll be different, and that's okay. And this profound not knowing is why we hosted this series of talks at Black Spark, introducing the left and anarcho-folks to animism and animist practices, because it's time. Time to let go of notions of time. Time to heal our minds and bodies and families and reconnect with ancestral wisdom. Time to allow love to be our guide. Time to be still and silent. Time to be receptive to old and new ways of knowing and being. Time to allow stories to weave us back into relationship with our many furry and scaled and barked kin and the magnificent unfolding cosmos. Time to put down roots like a mighty oak where we